Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Poetry Thursday. This is a tiny little BookTube event where all the coolest BookTube channels read a poem, or maybe more than one poem, on Thursday. I'm not one of those cool channels, and I have turned Poetry Thursday into a weird psychodrama where I am grappling with all of 20th century American poetry in chronological order. I'm just dealing with this one anthology until we're all the way through to the end of it. I don't know if it's going to break me or I'm going to break it, but we're going to keep going. And when you deal with an anthology like this, when you get to know it really well, uh, you start to realize the characteristics of anthologies. Something like this, 20th century American poetry, is not my favorite poems. It's not called anything like that, or most beloved poems. The title implies a lesser degree of subjectivity, more of an eye towards something being a canon of some kind or other. And when you have a situation like that, like for instance the Oxford Book of English Verse, there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be in there. I mean, it's a creative endeavor, so I guess nothing has to be in there. But if you're going to make an anthology of 20th century English verse, for instance, there's a lot of stuff that has to be in there. You're going to make one for the 19th century. There's a lot of stuff, there names anyway, that have to be in there. And that's true here too. There's no way you can do 20th century American poetry and leave out the biggest figures in 20th century American poetry. You know that a book like this has to have um, Robert Frost, for instance, or E. Cummings. Something you know that there's going to be a roster of names in here, and the characteristic of a big anthology. There are a couple of characteristics that you have to deal with as well as that. And one is that the editors involved will have private picks of their own. Was there a mentor at school, a poet who had a minor reputation in the 40s and is now forgotten, and rightly so, but you want to include them in this anthology? Well, you're going to get away with that. If you try to do that, you're going to get away with that. Or have you always had a liking for a very minor poet of one school or other, and you feel they belong in there? Well, the editors are going to meet, or they're going to correspond, or whatnot, and they're going to work that out. And almost always the answer is going to be yes, within limits, yes. And there's another indulgence that editors of volumes like this have to do. Of course, there are figures that have to be in here, but there are also poems that kinda have to be in here, kinda. Whether or not they come from poets who deserve a place in this pantheon. I don't agree with that. I think if you're editors in a volume like this and you know that one poet had one poem that really took off, we've encountered some of those. I think as editors, it's incumbent on you to look at that and say, all right, well, yes, okay, this poem took off and was the intellectual currency of all the writing world for 10 years, 2 years, a year. But that doesn't mean the poet deserves to be in here. That was just a fad of the time. And I think it's incumbent on editors to leave such figures out, to make room for more poems by the people who deserve to be in here. But you're going to encounter it one way or another. We've encountered it already in this book, and we encounter it today as well, with a poet called Dudley Randall, who lived from 1914 to the year 2000, and who, in 1963, there was a church bombing in Atlanta. It made all the news. It was talked about, editorialized about, written about, sermonized about, sung about, a lot. And Dudley Randall wrote a poem about it that became famous, incredibly famous, far more famous than anything else that he wrote, and the only thing of his that is remembered, usually. Our editors here say that he wrote other good stuff, and they include two other poems, but this poem, the Ballad of Birmingham, is why he's in this volume. So we're going to read that poem, and not any of the others. We're not going to pretend that this is a major overlooked poet. He wrote a poem that hit the zeitgeist. That happens. It doesn't often happen to a poet who is also legitimately across the board great. It's happened to Longfellow a couple of times, but we don't have any Longfellows. But anyway, let's just read this poem, and that'll be it for this poet, for Detroit's poet laureate. This is called Ballad of Birmingham, and the subscription is on the bombing of a church in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. Mother dear, may I go downtown instead of out to play and march the streets of Birmingham in a freedom march today? No, baby, no, you may not go, for the dogs are fierce and wild, and clubs and hoses, guns and jail aren't good for a little child. But, mother, I won't be alone. Other children will go with me and march the streets of Birmingham to make our country free. No, baby, no, you may not go, for I fear those guns will fire. But you may go to church instead and sing in the children's choir. She has combed and brushed her night dark hair and bathed rose petals sweet and drawn white gloves on her small brown hands and white shoes on her feet. The mother smiled to know her child was in the sacred place, and that smile was the last smile to come upon her face. For when she heard the explosion, her eyes grew wet and wild. She raced through the streets of Birmingham, calling for her child. She clawed through bits of glass and brick, then lifted out a shoe. Oh, here's the shoe my baby wore, but baby, where are you? That's mighty effective. I admit, that is mighty effective. I've read it a million times. I've read it in lots of anthologies, and it is mighty effective. Rendered all the more so by the author's decision to put it in the sing-song end rhyme versification of a Longfellow, of a previous era. Other poets have made this decision. When they want a poem to stick, they tended to do this. That works really, really well. Nothing else that this poet wrote works anywhere near that well. That's not a negative thing to say. Most of us will never write an immortal poem. Most of us will never write anything that had that kind of emotional depth. It's not a negative thing. It's not a slight on this poet to say that that's the only thing he wrote that had that kind of mythic resonance. And it's in here. And I guess there's an argument to be made that if you're putting a volume together, 20th century American poetry, you can't not have it. So you might as well have it in here. I guess the thing that I'm objecting to is the implication in the introductory paragraph to this poet on the part of the editors that he is worth studying, or that he just in general is worth being in here, when he was lucky. He hit the zeitgeist with a really good, very effective poem. We're going to encounter more of those, but that's it for today. It's a very, very low-key Poetry Thursday, but we'll see what comes next. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, BookTube.